The moment I saw someone else's boots on my desk, I knew the company was already dead. Not metaphorically, not heading in the wrong direction. Dead. Mud-streaked designer boots, planted right on the walnut surface I'd worked 14 years to earn. Like my office was a bus stop bench. Sitting in my chair was a kid, 24, maybe 25, with bleached hair, a vape dangling from his fingers, and the vacant confidence of someone who had never once been told no. He looked up, grinned, and said, "Oh, you must be Leo. Dad said you'd be cool." Then he did something that made my blood go cold. He lifted his phone, leaned back in my chair, and took a selfie. From my desk, from my office. Posted it instantly. Caption, "Day 1, finally running this place." That was the exact second my emotions shut off. Not anger, not shock, calculation. Because I'd seen this species before. Nepotism with Wi-Fi. I'd spent 14 years turning a regional shipping tracker into a 9-figure logistics backbone. I'd survived consultants, pivots, and 3 CEOs who thought cloud migration was a vibe. But this was different. This wasn't incompetence pretending to be leadership. This was arrogance that didn't even bother wearing a disguise. His name was Nolan Hart, son of the incoming CEO. No title, no clearance, no clue. And yet there he was, announcing control of a company in the middle of an acquisition blackout window. Here's the part that matters. I didn't react. I didn't correct him. I didn't say a word. Because 3 months earlier, while everyone else was drunk on Series D champagne, I'd been reading the merger agreement at 2:11 a.m., Clause 9, page 52, a single paragraph buried under compliance sludge. Any public misrepresentation of authority, reputational harm, or implied executive control by any affiliated party constituted immediate grounds for termination at the buyer's discretion. Nolan's post was geotagged, time-stamped, public, from inside the building. On day 1, he hadn't just crossed a line, he detonated it. I walked past him without eye contact, printed the acquisition packet I'd memorized, highlighted Clause 9 in red, stapled the screenshot to it, and slid it into legal's inbox. CC'd no one. BCC'd everyone who mattered. Then I packed 1 box. Laptop stayed. Badge stayed. My name, face up, on the desk he was still occupying. He didn't even notice me leave. That was fine. Systems always record who's at the console when the trigger gets pulled, and Nolan had both hands on it. By the time I reached the parking lot, my phone had already started vibrating. Not calls, emails, the quiet kind. The kind that don't ask questions, they confirm fears. Legal acknowledging receipt. Compliance asking for clarification on authority representation. Procurement suddenly very interested in licensing ownership. I didn't answer any of them. I sat in my car for a full minute with the engine off, hands on the wheel, breathing slow. Panic is loud. Confidence is quiet. I drove past the loading docks on my way out. The same docks whose traffic logic I'd personally rewritten after a near-fatal scheduling cascade 8 years earlier. Forklifts beeped. Trucks reversed. Everything worked. That was my signature. You never noticed me until I was gone. I didn't go home. I went to the storage unit, the one nobody at the company knew existed because nobody ever asked where the temporary consulting overflow went. Inside was a filing cabinet and a single binder labeled in black marker, contingencies. I'd put it together the week the acquisition rumors started leaking into Slack. NDAs, red lines, patent drafts, and the most important thing of all, licensing documents for the middleware layer everyone casually referred to as the core. They thought it was internal. It wasn't. It belonged to my LLC, quietly registered 3 years earlier after I watched another visionary wipe out an engineering team and walk away with their work. Every system I touched had a dependency, a heartbeat, a token, all licensed, all revocable. I'd learned the hard way that loyalty without leverage is just unpaid charity. I got home, made coffee, and opened my laptop. I still had access, mirrored credentials, not a hack, a redundancy. One folder blinked on the screen, Merger Watch. Inside were months of correspondence. Buyer-side notes calling my architecture mission-critical. Integration diagrams built on assumptions I controlled. At 9:48 a.m., the first real crack appeared. An internal message in the buyer's shared channel. Who is Nolan Hart, and why is he claiming operational control? I watched the typing dots appear and disappear like nervous heartbeats. At 10:12, integration calls started dropping off calendars. At 10:31, the buyer's external counsel sent the email that changes tone in buildings. Subject: urgent clarification required. No greeting, 3 questions. Who is Nolan? What authority does he have? Does the statement reflect a shift in control? Silence followed. Then the CEO responded. My son, no formal role, attempted humor. That was when I smiled for the first time all day. Humor doesn't survive contracts. Screenshots don't care about intent. By noon, Nolan's post was everywhere. LinkedIn, VC meme accounts. Due diligence matters. This is why clauses exist. Inside the company, the mood curdled. People paced. Directors whispered. Someone asked where I was. No one had an answer. They were about to learn what Clause 9 really meant. By early afternoon, silence had replaced denial, and that's always the most dangerous phase. Calendars cleared themselves like animals fleeing a fire. The buyer's Slack channel went dark mid-thread. No goodbye emojis, no polite corporate hedging, just absence. Inside the company, executives started doing that thing where they pretend to be calm while their eyes give them away. The first emergency meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. and labeled alignment. Everyone knew what that meant. I watched it unfold from a mirrored inbox I'd never been asked to surrender. Legal had finally finished reading Clause 9 instead of skimming it. Compliance had finished cross-checking timestamps. IT had confirmed the post was made from inside the building, on the corporate network, using a guest credential that traced back to the CEO's badge. That last detail landed like a dropped plate. The buyer's second message came through at 2:47, shorter this time. All integration activities suspended pending review. That wasn't leverage. That was a chokehold. Nolan, meanwhile, was still wandering the floor asking where the cold brew tap was and why admin access wasn't working for him. Someone finally pulled him aside and told him to delete the post. He laughed, said it had traction. By the time his phone was taken from him, it didn't matter. The internet had already archived him. Screenshots multiplied. Someone slapped his caption over a stock photo of a clown car and tagged it #Day1Leadership. The board call started without me. That alone told them everything they needed to know. When the CEO tried to explain it away as optics, someone asked the question that always ends careers. Where's Leo? No answer. Procurement spoke next, voice shaking. We can't map ownership of the analytics layer. Finance followed. The licensing appears external. Legal finally said it out loud. The middleware is owned by an entity called Northline Systems LLC. The room went quiet. That was my company. My paperwork. Filed, disclosed, approved months earlier, and ignored because it was easier to let me handle it. The CEO asked if the license could be terminated. Legal shook their head. Survivability clause. Even if the deal died, the license stood. Revocation required consent. Mine. That was the moment the room understood this wasn't a PR problem. It was structural. They'd lost the buyer, and they didn't own the engine anymore. And the kid with his feet on my desk? He'd been the one to light the fuse. The buyer didn't raise their voice. They didn't threaten. They didn't posture. That's how you know it's over. At 4:18 p.m., a courier arrived at Legal with a sealed envelope. Physical. Old school. Signature required. The subject line on the cover letter was clinical to the point of cruelty. Notice of material breach. Clause 9 enforcement. The buyer was invoking their right to halt the acquisition immediately, pending internal review, with full discretion to terminate without penalty. No negotiation language, no soft exits, just a legal eject button, pulled cleanly. The CEO read it twice, then a third time slower, as if repetition might change the words. It didn't. He said, "This isn't final." Someone else replied, "It is." The next hour was chaos without volume. Directors pacing, phones lighting up, investor calls ignored. The CFO quietly confirming that 3 partners had already frozen joint initiatives. One vendor emailed a single sentence. "We trusted Leo. We don't trust this." That one hurt them more than any lawyer. Someone suggested issuing an apology. Someone else suggested blaming a rogue actor. Legal shut both down. Clause 9 didn't care about apologies. It didn't care about intent. It cared about public misrepresentation during an active acquisition window. And Nolan had gift-wrapped exactly that. At 6:02 p.m., the board scheduled a closed session for the next morning. No assistants, no laptops, just directors and 2 lawyers. When they opened with "Let's be surgical," everyone understood what that meant. First vote, Nolan Hart. Immediate ban from premises, systems, communications. Unanimous. Second vote, the CEO. Administrative leave pending investigation. The vote passed before he finished objecting. His badge was disabled mid-sentence. By 9:11 a.m., he was escorted out with a box that looked lighter than his ego. Then they turned to the real problem, me. They drafted the email together, every word cautious, deferential, desperate. Request for clarification, invitation to re-engage, acknowledgement of strain. Sent, delivered, read. My reply came 10 minutes later, 1 line. My intent was to prevent damage. Your leadership beat me to it. No greeting, no signature. Silence followed. They finally understood. I wasn't angry. I wasn't negotiating. I'd already won. That silence after my reply was louder than any threat I could have made. You could feel it ripple outward through the building, through inboxes and boardrooms and investor calls that suddenly stopped getting returned. The board reconvened an hour later, this time without pretense. No talk of optics, no talk of messaging. Just one question hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. How do we survive this? Legal laid it out with the kind of brutal honesty that only appears when denial is no longer an option. The acquisition was effectively dead unless the buyer chose otherwise. The systems the buyer wanted were inseparable from the middleware layer. The middleware layer was licensed through Northline Systems LLC. Northline Systems LLC was mine, and I was under no obligation to do anything except exactly what I was already doing. Nothing. The CFO asked if they could rebuild. Engineering shook their heads. 18 to 24 months minimum, assuming no attrition and unlimited budget. Someone laughed once, sharp and humorless, because attrition had already started. 3 senior engineers had requested emergency PTO. 1 vendor had suspended service pending governance clarification. The board chair finally said the quiet part out loud. We sidelined the wrong person. No one disagreed. Meanwhile, Nolan was learning what consequences feel like in real time. His badge didn't open doors anymore. His Slack stopped loading. His email bounced. HR informed him he was no longer welcome on site, effective immediately. He kept asking when his dad would fix it. No one answered. The buyer's rep finally agreed to a call, but not with the company, with me. They wanted the system. They wanted continuity. They wanted to know if the architecture they'd spent 6 months evaluating was still available. I joined the call from my kitchen, coffee in hand, hoodie on, calm as stone. They didn't apologize. They didn't need to. They asked one question. Are you open to licensing directly? I said yes. Then I named a number 3 times higher than the original rate. There was a pause. Then a second question. And governance? I answered without hesitation. Board seat. Full vote. Silence again. This time, different. Respect. When the board was informed of my terms, there was no outrage, just relief. Concession is easier than collapse. They voted to approve before anyone could talk themselves out of it. I never raised my voice. I never asked for credit. I just let the system do what it was designed to do. Log the breach, trigger the clause, shift control. And by the time they realized what had happened, there was no button left to undo it. The formalities came next, slow and methodical, like a body being prepared for burial. Paperwork moved faster than people. Board resolutions were drafted, revised, approved, and stamped in under 48 hours. The buyer's legal team didn't celebrate. They never do. They simply acknowledged the new reality and adjusted their models accordingly. The company, meanwhile, entered what consultants politely call a stability phase, which is corporate language for controlled freefall. The interim CEO tried to project confidence, sending all-hands emails full of phrases like resilience and forward momentum. Nobody believed a word. Too many screens were dark, too many desks empty. People know when gravity has shifted. Procurement reopened contracts under revised assumptions. Finance recalculated forecasts with my licensing costs baked in. The numbers were uglier, but they were real. For the first time in weeks, they had something solid to stand on. The buyer scheduled a joint session, this time officially listing Northline Systems LLC as a strategic partner. Not a vendor, not a footnote, a partner. That distinction mattered. It meant I wasn't a resource anymore. I was an axis. Inside the company, the narrative quietly flipped. Nolan's name became something people avoided saying out loud, like a curse you didn't want to activate. The CEO's portrait disappeared from the hallway overnight, replaced by a generic landscape photo no one could remember choosing. HR updated policies. Access protocols were rewritten. Shadowing was no longer a thing. Every rule written in blood gets followed. I joined the next board call exactly on time. Camera on, neutral background, no pleasantries. The buyer spoke first, outlining revised terms. The board listened. When it was my turn, I clarified one point. Operational independence. My systems, my oversight, no interference. They agreed immediately. There was no bargaining power left to pretend otherwise. Someone thanked me. I ignored it. Gratitude is cheap when leverage is gone. The vote passed unanimously. My board seat was confirmed. Full voting rights. The meeting ended without drama. No speeches, no applause, just quiet acceptance. Afterward, my inbox filled with messages from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. Glad you're back. We should have listened. Can we talk? I didn't answer most of them. Not out of spite, out of focus. I had work to do, systems to stabilize, futures to reroute. By the end of the week, the buyer announced a revised integration timeline. The deal wasn't resurrected. It was reborn, under new terms, with new power lines. The market reacted cautiously, then positively. Stability is contagious. Chaos is too. The difference is who controls the switch. The aftershocks didn't come all at once. They never do. They arrived in waves, each one quieter than the last, but heavier. Investors who had gone silent started asking careful questions again. Vendors who had frozen contracts quietly reactivated them, usually with a single line, proceeding under updated governance. No one mentioned Nolan. No one mentioned his father. Those names were already being edited out of the company's memory, like corrupted files. The interim leadership leaned hard on process, because process is what you hide behind when charisma fails. Every decision now had a checklist. Every access request had a paper trail. The building felt different, slower, quieter, more careful. That was the cost of surviving your own arrogance. From my side of the table, the work was almost boring. That's how you know it's right. I audited the integration roadmap, confirmed dependency isolation, and granted the buyer controlled access to exactly what they needed and nothing more. No favors, no shortcuts. They didn't ask for any. Respect had replaced familiarity. The board meetings settled into a rhythm. When I spoke, people listened. When I disagreed, the conversation stopped. Not because I was louder, but because I was accurate. The interim CEO tried once to suggest optimizing around one of my safeguards. I reminded him, calmly, that the safeguard existed because the last leadership team had optimized themselves out of a company. He nodded and moved on. Nolan attempted to resurface through back channels. A LinkedIn message, a mutual contact asking if there was a path forward. There wasn't. Consequences don't negotiate. The buyer's rep sent a private note one evening. You handled this cleanly. That was as close to praise as I needed. Clean means contained. Clean means survivable. Inside the company, people adjusted to the new reality. Some resented it. Some respected it. Most were just relieved the floor had stopped shaking. A senior engineer stopped me in the hallway one morning and said, "It feels like the system has a spine again." I thanked him and kept walking. I didn't build systems to be loved. I built them to hold. By the end of the quarter, the revised deal was formally announced. Smaller headline. Better structure. No victory laps. The stock stabilized. Analysts stopped using words like risk exposure and started using words like governance. That's how you know trust is returning. Quietly. Earned, not marketed. And all of it traced back to a single moment. A pair of muddy boots on a desk. A selfie posted by someone who thought access was the same thing as authority. He never understood what he'd triggered, but everyone else did. Once the dust settled, the rewrites began. Not in press releases, but in behavior. That's where the real edits happen. Meetings started on time. Agendas were followed. People stopped improvising authority and started documenting it. The company learned, the hard way, that governance isn't a vibe, it's infrastructure. I spent most of that month untangling assumptions. Everyone assumes the system belongs to the company. It doesn't. It belongs to whoever understands it well enough to define its limits. I formalized boundaries, locked interfaces, and documented ownership in language so clear even a distracted board member couldn't miss it. The buyer appreciated that. Predictability is worth more than charisma when real money is involved. The interim CEO asked me once, quietly, if I'd ever considered taking the top job. I said no. Power that visible attracts the wrong kind of attention. Control is more effective when it's boring. Nolan's disappearance became complete. His accounts went dark. His name stopped appearing in meeting notes. HR removed him from every internal system like he'd never existed. His father's exit followed the standard corporate script. But inside the building, everyone knew the truth. He hadn't been pushed out by enemies. He'd been undone by access he never should have shared. The buyer's team integrated smoothly under the new structure. Their engineers respected the boundaries. Their lawyers stopped circling. Their executives stopped asking who was in charge, because the answer was finally consistent. Me, or more accurately, the framework I enforced. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is emotional. This was corrective. The market doesn't punish arrogance out of spite. It does it out of necessity. By mid-quarter, requests started coming in from outside. Other firms, other boards, quiet inquiries. We heard you handled a difficult transition. We're concerned about continuity. Can we talk? I declined most of them. Scarcity is part of leverage. I accepted a few, selectively, through Northline. Always on my terms, always documented, always reversible. One evening, alone in my office at home, I pulled up the original selfie. The muddy boots, the caption. It looked smaller now, less threatening. Like a spark you barely notice after the fire's already burned through everything combustible. I closed the image and shut the laptop. The system was stable. That was enough. Stability has a sound. It's not silence. It's a low, steady hum, the kind you only notice when it's gone. By the time the quarter closed, that hum had returned. Revenue projections stopped wobbling. Vendor SLAs normalized. Support tickets dropped to baseline. The buyer's quarterly report listed the partnership as operationally sound, which is the closest thing to praise their lawyers ever allow. Inside the company, the last remnants of the old regime were quietly archived. Policies rewritten, access logs audited. Anything informal was either formalized or killed. People adjusted because they had to. Survival teaches discipline faster than training ever could. The board meetings became shorter, decisions cleaner. There was no longer a need for theatrics because there was nothing left to hide. One afternoon, the CFO pulled me aside and asked what would have happened if I'd reacted differently that first morning. If I'd confronted Nolan. If I'd demanded an apology. If I'd made noise. I told him the truth. None of this would exist. Noise gives people time to coordinate lies. Silence gives systems room to record facts. The breach logged itself. The clause triggered itself. I just made sure the right people saw it. The company hosted a quiet offsite a few weeks later. No speeches, no hype. Just operational reviews and uncomfortable honesty. Someone mentioned culture reset. I corrected them. This isn't culture. This is structure. Culture adapts to incentives. Structure decides outcomes. They wrote that down. Nolan's name surfaced once more, indirectly, when legal finalized a new nepotism policy that read like it had been drafted by someone who'd been burned. No unsupervised access, no implied authority, no exceptions for family. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The buyer's rep sent a final note before the integration phase officially closed. We're satisfied with the resolution. That was it. No congratulations, no fanfare. Satisfaction meant the risk had been contained. That was the win. I walked through the building one last time as an observer, not an employee. People nodded. Some smiled. Some looked away. Power rearranges social geometry. I didn't linger. I'd already moved on. The system didn't need me hovering. It needed me reachable. There's a difference. And as I stepped out into the afternoon light, I realized something simple and sharp. The damage hadn't been caused by malice. It had been caused by access without understanding. And the correction hadn't come from anger. It had come from preparation. The trap had been set long before anyone knew they were walking toward it. The ending wasn't loud. Endings like that never are. There was no public reckoning, no dramatic apology tour, no viral clip of someone admitting fault. Just paperwork, signatures, and a slow, irreversible shift in who held the weight of the company. The revised deal closed quietly under the new structure. Analysts moved on. The market adjusted. History condensed itself into a footnote about governance challenges during acquisition. Nolan Hart became a cautionary anecdote told in half sentences and lowered voices. His father faded into the long list of executives who believed proximity to power was the same as competence. It wasn't. It never is. Northline Systems LLC became the backbone supplier the buyer had originally wanted, just without the liability attached. My board seat remained. My vote mattered. My systems ran. I didn't take an office in the building. I didn't want one. Control doesn't need a corner view. It needs clarity. A month later, I received the final internal memo. Subject: integration complete. It thanked teams for their resilience, referenced lessons learned, and avoided names entirely. That was fine. Names aren't the point. Outcomes are. I shut down the mirrored credentials that afternoon. No more quiet access. No more watching from the outside. The system didn't need a guardian anymore. It had rules. That night, I sat on my porch as a storm rolled in from the west, thunder low and distant. I poured a drink, not to celebrate, just to mark the moment. My phone buzzed with new inquiries. Other companies, other boards, same pattern. We hear you're good at preventing disasters. I smiled at that. Prevention never looks impressive from the outside. It just looks like nothing happened. I answered a few, declined most. Scarcity remained intact. Somewhere in another city, Nolan was probably telling a story where he'd been misunderstood, where it was just a joke, where none of this was his fault. That was fine too. The system didn't care what story he told. It cared what he logged. And the log was permanent. I never raised my voice, never made a scene, never asked for recognition. I forwarded one email, walked away, and let the structure do the rest. That's the thing about real leverage. When it works, it doesn't look like revenge. It looks like inevitability.